Welcome to section 4. So in this section, we're actually splitting this up into 3 days to help you get really, really good again at factoring. Now, the good thing is factoring, you've seen all of this before. You factored all these types of things back in Expo. Now it's just re-remembering how to go about doing this for all these different factoring scenarios. The biggest thing I want you to remember is factoring is the reverse of foiling. So if you remember foiling, all right, so that first, outside, inside, last, when you're multiplying two binomials together, factoring is simply the opposite of that. It's the reverse of that, to put things back into their little parenthesis form. Now, what I've done on this first page is all just one nicely worked out example with explanations for every step. So this isn't really notes for us to do together per se. This is for you to reflect on. Let's say you're working through a problem, you get confused. This first page right here is kind of your go-to spot to go and get help and remember why I did each step. Now, the first thing you're going to do, so here is an example of factoring, a problem to factor. All right, so the first step is to look at that first term, so that x squared. Now remember from the foiling process, those first two terms, those are what make that x squared term. So I need to find two things that multiply to give me x squared, which in this case is pretty obvious, is x and x. That's going to be the case today. So I'm sure you remember back in Expo, we talked about that case when a equals 1. That's what today is going to be about, all right? So in all these cases, whenever you just have an x squared first, those first two terms are going to be x and x. Then the second step, you look at that last number, okay, that 12. And what you want to do is you want to break it down into any possible combination of numbers that multiply to 12. In this case, that would be 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. So get in the habit of writing all of those out. What I usually do is I just write it like this. So after you have that, now you want to look to see what combinations can I make. Because when you put those numbers in, the important things are these combinations here. So when you plop them in, the 3x and the 4x, that's what it takes to combine to give you that middle term, that 7x. So the middle term is really the goal of what you're trying to get, but it's the last thing that you do, the last thing that you focus on. You focus on the first and the last first, and then get the middle. Again, today is all the nice cases, all right? But in the future, we're going to get some not so nice cases. So I really want you to focus on this process, okay? Looking for those green combinations. Now, I'm sure you remember, with factoring, the best thing you can do is just practice, practice, practice. Okay, that's the best way to get good at this skill. So, I'm going to first set up my two parentheses. All right, that's the first thing I like to do. When I see that I'm working with a quadratic trinomial, I always just make those two parentheses. And so now I can focus on the x squared. Well, this times this gives me that x squared, so x times x. Come over here and look at that 20. So I need to find the combination of things that multiply to 20. Well, 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 3 doesn't divide 20, so there won't be anything there. Then I get 4 and 5. And now if I were to keep going, well, listing 5 and 4 would be the same thing. So this is actually it. I have my entire list. So now I need to find the combination that will combine to give me the 9x. So I think you guys can probably see relatively quickly that here, that'll give me 4x, that'll give me 5x, and that's what it takes to give me that 9x. All right, and so that is my answer using the x plus 4 and the x plus 5 to factor it. All right, how about this next one? And again, the first thing I like to do is I like to set up my parentheses. What times what gives me x squared? Well, again, the nice thing is today, that's always going to be the same, x and x. I focus on the 25. Well, 1 times 25, 2 doesn't divide it, 3 doesn't divide it, 4 doesn't divide it, but 5 does. 5 times 5. And then again, I'm just going to quit there because I know that if I tried 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, so on and so forth, nothing else is going to work. These are the only two combinations that multiply to give me 25. And I'm going to focus on that 10. Now I need to choose the pair of numbers that will combine to give me 10. So, and again, hopefully it's pretty easy to see that if you do 5 and 5, 5x plus 5x is where that 10x comes from. Now this one is even a little bit more unique because notice I got two of the same thing, x plus 5 and x plus 5. So if I'm multiplying the same thing by itself, the good habit I want you to get into, something that'll help you later on, is if you write it like that. Remember, multiplying it, something times itself, is the same thing as squaring it. So I'm going to write it that way just because later on, that's going to be really, really helpful to us. All right, so let's keep going. So I'm going to put my parentheses down. That x squared comes from x times x. 72. Well, this is going to have a few more options. So 1 and 72, then 2 and 36, 3 and 24, 4 and 18, 5 doesn't work, but 6 and 12, then 7 doesn't work, then you get 8 and 9. So this one has a whole ton of options of things that multiply to 72. All right? Now, the thing I want you to keep in mind, though, is notice this. Notice that inside number is negative, okay? So I'm looking for two numbers that combine to be negative, so they add to be negative, yet they multiply to be positive. So this is a little twist now. Two things that multiply to be positive, yet add to be negative. How does that work? Well, how that works is you're actually talking about two negative numbers. Because two negative numbers will add to be negative, yet negatives multiply to be positive. Okay, so that's the next little twist that I need you to know in this factoring process. Is when you're multiplying to be positive, adding to be negative, you're searching for two negative numbers. And again, now I just start searching through that list. I search through the list, and here I'm drawn to the 8 and the 9, because negative 8x and negative 9x give me that negative 17x that I'm looking for. All right, and then the next one kind of shows you the same trick to help it settle in. So I'm going to build my parentheses. X squared comes from x times x. 17. Well, 17 is easy because it's prime. There's only one thing that multiplies to 17, and that is 1 times itself. 1 times 17. All right, so that actually makes it really easy because, again, notice that middle. That middle is negative. So we're looking for two things that multiply to be positive, yet add to be negative. So right away, I know I'm talking about two negative numbers. And so that really only leaves one option here. So here, negative 1x, negative 17x, and that does indeed combine to give me negative 18x. All right, so those are all the ones where that last number, that C number, is positive. Okay, and then I showed you the tricks for what to do about that middle number. Well, let's talk about when C is negative. Okay, what happens when that last number is negative? So, first let's set up our parentheses. And then what I'm always looking for is what gives me x squared. So x and x. Then my focus is the 15. So 1 and 15, 2 doesn't work, 3 and 5, 4 doesn't work, and then when I get to 5, 5 is already on the list, so then everything would just start repeating. So these are the only two things that give me, or that multiply to 15. Now, the unique thing here is that is actually a negative 15. So when we're dealing with a negative in there, what that means is we want to find the combination of numbers where the difference gives us that middle. Okay? So how can we find the difference of those two numbers to be that middle number? Well, I think probably you're drawn to the 3 and the 5, right? Because that'll be 3x and that'll be 5x. Now we want the difference between those two to be negative 2. So what that means is that this one is going to have to carry that negative for me. Okay, that 5 is going to have to carry the negative, and the 3 is going to have to carry the positive. Because that's how that'll combine to give me a negative 2x. All right, because notice, that is what I got in the end. But so what you're really looking for is the difference to be that negative 2. And again, you do that because one of them ultimately is going to turn negative, because that's how you multiply to be negative. One has to be negative, one has to be positive. But when you're just looking at the numbers, the first thing you can think of is, oh, I just want the difference to be that middle number. And then you can pick, all right, which one needs to be negative, which one needs to be the positive of that combination. So let's get a little bit more practice with this. So I'm going to set up my parentheses. Two things that multiply to x squared. Well, today, that's always going to be really nice. X and x. Focus on the 18. So 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. Then 4 doesn't work, 5 doesn't work. Then that brings us back to 6, which is already on the list. So those are the three things that are going to work for us. And now we need to look for the difference between two of those numbers, that is 3x, because notice that is negative. So one of these numbers is going to be negative, implying that we need to find the difference between those. Well, which one of those pairs has a difference of 3? Well, I think you're going to be drawn to the 3 and the 6. That'll give us 3x and 6x. Now, we need to figure out which one is going to carry that negative. Which one is going to get the negative? Well, if we put it here, 6x minus 3x gives us positive 3x. So the 3 is going to carry the negative, and the 6 is going to carry the positive. All right, so let's keep going. This one here. Again, always set up your parentheses. x squared comes from x and x. 13 is nice because it's prime. So that is the only combination that multiplies to 13. But again, I'm going to notice right away that it is a negative 13. I'm multiplying to a negative number, so that means one of my numbers will be negative, one will be positive. So when I'm searching, I need to search for the difference between them to be that 12 that we have in the middle. Now, we already know that 1 and 13 are going to fit in there. So we have 1x, 13x, and we want a positive 12. So what that means is that 1 is going to have to carry the negative. 13x minus 1x is what gives me positive 12x. So put the negative there, the positive there, and we've got it. All right, last one for our notes. So, going to identify that I need x and x to multiply to be x squared. Things that multiply to 6, well, 1 and itself, and 2 and 3. All right, so now again, I notice that that 6 is negative. So that means I need to find which combination has a difference of 1. All right, now I think right away that I'll probably draw you to 2 and 3. 2 and 3 have a difference of 1. So 2x and 3x. So 2x and 3x, in order to combine them to be a positive 1, it's going to have to be the 2 that's negative. 3x minus 2x leaves me with 1x. And that's how I pick which one it is. All right, so hopefully this was a helpful review of all those factoring skills. So now that you're done watching, please take a moment to write that summary and how you're going to remember this skill, and then come back to class prepared to do your practice work.